The first time I heard him cry, it wasn't the kind of cry that comes from a spoiled child who didn't get his dessert, or from a tantrum that parents hush with promises of ice cream. It was a sound that cut through the air like glass cracking in slow motion, fragile and sharp, a sound of loneliness so profound it made everyone in the restaurant shift uncomfortably in their seats. I remember the way forks paused midair, the clinking of wine glasses stopped, and even the soft jazz playing through the ceiling speakers seemed to fade as though the room itself was holding its breath. I turned my head from where I stood behind the counter, gripping an order pad that had long lost any real use because the dinner rush was over, and only the late-night stragglers remained. The boy was sitting in one of the back corner booths, small, maybe 5 years old, with hair dark as wet ink, and eyes the kind of blue that seemed too big for his pale, tired face. He was dressed in expensive clothes, a little button-up shirt and suspenders, but his small fists were balled up, rubbing tears across his cheeks until his skin turned pink. Across from him sat a man who didn't belong here, not in this fading Italian restaurant where the wallpaper peeled in quiet corners and the air smelled faintly of garlic and weariness. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than I made in a month, and even from across the room, I could see the power radiating off him like heat from asphalt. He had one of those faces that made you forget how to breathe for a second, not just because he was beautiful in that dangerous, sharp-edged way, but because his stillness was suffocating, as if he didn't need to move to command a room. He leaned over the table, his voice low and tense, his hand trying to reach the boy. But the child jerked away from him, the cry rising higher, more desperate. The man's jaw clenched, his eyes flashing something between fury and helplessness. He didn't know how to handle this. I could tell immediately. Men like him always think they can control everything. Business, fear, loyalty, but not a child's heartbreak. I hesitated. It wasn't my place to interfere. I'd been working here for 6 months, long enough to know when to keep my head down, long enough to sense danger even when it smiled politely and tipped generously. But something about the boy's trembling shoulders and the way his little chest shook with each sob made something twist in me, something that I hadn't felt in years, something I thought I'd buried deep under layers of routine and exhaustion. Before I knew it, I was walking toward them, my sneakers silent against the old wooden floor. I caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with the faint aroma of wine and leather, and when I reached the table, the man's eyes lifted to mine. For a moment, I forgot what breathing felt like. His eyes were dark, not brown, but black, the kind that reflected light instead of absorbing it. There was a storm behind them, and when they met mine, I felt like I was being measured, weighed, and silently warned all at once. His voice was low when he finally spoke, a slow, controlled rumble that seemed to vibrate through the air. "He's fine." The words were clipped, final, but they weren't true. The boy wasn't fine. He was breaking apart, right there in front of us. I swallowed hard, the words escaping before I could think better of them. "He's not," I said softly, my tone gentle, careful, like I was stepping on ice that might crack beneath me. "He's scared." The man's eyes flickered, barely perceptible, a muscle ticking in his jaw. He didn't respond, but I saw his hand tighten around the glass of wine in front of him until his knuckles whitened. I crouched beside the boy, the smell of tears and linen soap and innocence filling the air between us. His small fingers were clenched around the edge of his plate, his lips trembling. I leaned close, my voice barely a whisper. "Hey," I murmured. "You okay, sweetheart?" He shook his head, his tiny shoulders heaving, and in that moment, I didn't see a stranger's child. I saw the ghost of a life I once imagined, a small heartbeat I'd once carried beneath my own, a memory I'd tried to forget. I swallowed the ache rising in my throat, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. I could feel the man's gaze burning into me, questioning, warning, curious. Still, I kept my eyes on the boy. "He just needs a mom," I whispered, more to myself than to anyone else, but the moment the words left my mouth, I felt the entire world shift. The man froze. His hand, mid-air, stopped as if the air itself had turned to stone. His eyes widened, just slightly, but it was enough to tell me that I'd crossed an invisible line. For a long, heavy second, none of us moved. The sound of the restaurant returned faintly. The clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the hum of the fridge. But it all felt distant, unimportant. Then, something in the boy changed. He hiccuped, blinking at me, his crying softening into small whimpers as if my voice had reached him from a place words couldn't. Slowly, he leaned toward me, his small fingers reaching out to touch my sleeve, his voice trembling like paper. "Can you stay?" he whispered. And those 3 words, were the beginning of everything. The man, his father, I realized, watched with something unreadable in his gaze, like he couldn't decide if he wanted to thank me or destroy me. He nodded once, curtly, a gesture of surrender or permission, I couldn't tell. "Thank you," he said after a long silence, his voice low and controlled. But there was something else there too, something that sounded almost like defeat. I forced a small smile, my pulse thundering in my throat. "It's okay. Kids they feel things we forget how to feel." He nodded again, then turned his attention back to his son, though I could feel his eyes flicking back to me, like a shadow refusing to let me go. When they finally left, the boy was asleep in his arms, his tiny head resting against the man's chest. The sight was disarmingly tender, almost painful in its contradiction. A man built of iron, holding something so small and breakable. As the door closed behind them, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. But the image lingered. Those dark eyes, that small trembling hand, and the way his name had rolled off the man's tongue when he whispered it to the sleeping boy. Matteo. I told myself I wouldn't think about them again. But that night, as I closed the restaurant, wiping down tables beneath flickering lights, I caught a glimpse through the window of a black car parked across the street, engine idling, headlights dimmed. And when I turned off the last light, I could still feel that gaze watching me through the dark. The next morning began like any other, or at least that's what I told myself as I stood in front of the cracked mirror above my sink, brushing my hair into something that looked halfway presentable for another long day of serving strangers. The rain from the night before had turned the city into a haze of reflections, puddles catching bits of gray sky, taxi lights bleeding into one another like bruises on wet asphalt. It should have been an ordinary morning, the kind where you forget your umbrella and curse your luck. But there was a weight in the air, a heaviness that settled deep in my chest before I even stepped outside. I kept thinking about the boy, the way his small hand had clutched my sleeve, the quiet way he'd said, "Can you stay?" and the look on his father's face when I'd said those foolish, reckless words. "He just needs a mom." It wasn't something you said to a man like that. A man with eyes that dark didn't hear things like that without remembering them. I tried to shake it off, but as I left my apartment, umbrella in hand, I froze halfway down the cracked staircase. A car was parked on the opposite curb. Sleek, black, expensive, the kind that didn't belong in my part of town, where the paint peeled off buildings and the scent of damp concrete never left the air. My pulse stuttered when I saw the man standing beside it. He was leaning against the car door, one hand in his coat pocket, the other holding a cigarette that he didn't seem to actually smoke. His hair was slicked back, rain beating on the collar of his black wool coat, his expression unreadable. The sight of him there, waiting like a scene carved out of a dream I didn't want to have, sent a shiver crawling up my spine. For a moment, I thought about turning back, pretending I'd forgotten something, maybe my keys, maybe my nerve, but his gaze caught mine, and suddenly it was too late. "Miss Lena," he said, his voice low, deliberate, almost smooth enough to hide the danger underneath. "You have a moment?" He knew my name. I hadn't told him my name. Something in my stomach twisted. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. Something that knew instinctively that this man didn't ask for things. He took them. Still, I nodded, clutching my bag like it could protect me from whatever this was. Of course, I managed, stepping closer, though every sensible part of me screamed to run. He gestured toward the car, opening the back door with a small, courteous motion. "Please, just a few minutes of your time. Mateo hasn't stopped talking about you." The sound of that name, the boy's name, was like a thread tugging at something fragile inside me. I hesitated, glancing into the car, the black leather interior shining faintly in the morning light. "He's okay?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. A faint smile flickered across his lips, gone almost as soon as it appeared. "He's better, but he refuses to eat unless you're there." My heart gave an involuntary ache. "That's sweet," I said softly, though the word didn't feel big enough for what I felt. "But look, I work all day. I can't just—" "I'll take care of your hours," he interrupted smoothly. "And your pay." The way he said it wasn't a suggestion. It was an arrangement already decided. I stared at him, at the calm certainty in his eyes. There was a chill in the way he moved, like control wasn't just a habit. It was the only way he knew how to breathe. I should have said no. I should have told him to leave me alone, that I didn't want to be dragged into whatever world he lived in. But then I thought of the boy, of the way he'd sobbed until his voice broke, of how his small hand had trembled when it touched mine. "Just for a few days," I said finally, more to myself than to him. "Until he's settled." He nodded once, as if that had been the plan all along. "Good." I climbed into the car, and before the door even shut behind me, the air changed. The scent of leather and cologne was suffocating, heavy, mixed with something faintly metallic. Power, maybe, or the ghost of blood. The driver didn't look back, just pulled smoothly into the street, the city blurring past as silence settled between us like smoke. I glanced at the man beside me, trying to read the shape of his expression. "You never told me your name," I said quietly. He turned his head slightly, those dark eyes cutting to me with a flicker of amusement. "Adrian," he said. "Adrian Moretti." The name hit me like a cold wind. I'd heard it before, whispered in corners of the restaurant, spoken with a mix of reverence and fear. The Morettis, a family name that carried weight in this city, though not the kind you found in phone books or history lessons. Their business was the kind that didn't need advertising, the kind that left bodies in rivers and cash in envelopes. I looked away quickly, pretending I hadn't recognized it, but my fingers tightened on my bag until my knuckles went white. The car wound through narrow streets before turning down a long, gated drive. The iron gates opened slowly, silently, and beyond them stretched a mansion that looked like it had been carved out of shadow and stone, grand but cold, the kind of place that looked beautiful only from far away. When the car stopped, Adrian stepped out first, then turned to offer me his hand. I hesitated before taking it, his palm warm, his grip firm, and for a fleeting second I felt the pulse of something dangerous under the surface, like holding the hand of someone who could crush and cradle you all at once. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and wealth, polished floors gleaming under dim light. A few servants moved quietly in the background, their eyes lowered, their movements careful. The house didn't feel lived in. It felt guarded. Then I heard it, the soft patter of small feet, and Mateo came running down the staircase, his little voice bright and breathless. "Lena!" Before I could react, he threw his arms around me, his tiny face pressed into my waist. The unexpected warmth of that small body against mine nearly undid me. I knelt down, brushing his hair back, forcing a smile even as my throat tightened. "Hey, you," I whispered. "You feeling better?" He nodded, eyes wide, his smile shy but real. "Daddy said you'd come." I looked up at Adrian, who stood at the bottom of the stairs, his expression unreadable, though something softer flickered there for just a second. "Matteo," he said gently, "show Miss Lena to the kitchen." The boy took my hand, pulling me down a hallway lined with old portraits and dark wood, his voice chattering about toys and breakfast, and something about a garden he wanted to show me later. But beneath it all, I could feel the weight of eyes on me. Watchful, assessing, invisible. When we reached the kitchen, I bent down to his level, my voice low. "You've got a big house, Matteo." He nodded, glancing around before leaning closer, whispering as if afraid of being heard. "Sometimes the walls talk at night." I froze, a chill crawling up my spine. "What do they say?" I asked softly. He shrugged, his little face serious. "They say Daddy's sad." The words hung between us like smoke, and I didn't know what to say. Later, as I poured him a glass of juice and helped him eat, I caught sight of Adrian standing in the doorway, watching. His eyes lingered on me too long, as if I'd already become part of something I didn't understand. And when the phone on the wall rang, sharp and sudden, he answered it with a curt tone. His back stiffened as he listened, the air shifting in an instant. Then his gaze flicked to me, hard and cold. "She's here," he said quietly into the receiver. "Yeah, I know what it means." He hung up without another word, and when he turned to me, his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Stay close to Matteo," he said softly, "no matter what you hear tonight." The Moretti mansion had a way of swallowing sound. Like every whisper that had ever been spoken inside it was still clinging to the walls, trapped beneath the weight of its silence. Even the footsteps of the servants seemed muted, their movements careful, rehearsed, almost ghost-like, as if they feared waking something that slept beneath the marble floors. From the moment I stepped through those heavy doors, I felt like I'd crossed into another kind of world, one made of glass and secrets, where every reflection seemed to be watching you back. Matteo had taken to me almost instantly, his small hand warm in mine as he led me through endless hallways lined with oil paintings of stern-faced men who shared the same sharp jaw and cold eyes as his father. The ceilings were high, the light dim, and though everything smelled of wealth, polish, linen, faint cologne, there was a hollowness beneath it, like no laughter had ever really lived here. Adrian had been called away soon after the phone call that morning, and though he hadn't said where he was going, his parting words still echoed in my mind. "Stay close to Matteo, no matter what you hear tonight." The unease that settled in my chest since then refused to leave, pressing against my ribs with every hour that passed. We spent most of the afternoon in the garden, a walled expanse of wild roses and old stone fountains, where Matteo ran through puddles left from the night's rain, laughing in that unrestrained, beautiful way only children can. Watching him, I felt something inside me thaw, something that had been frozen for years. His smile was bright enough to make me forget, for a fleeting moment, that this place made my skin crawl. When he finally grew tired, we went back inside. The light had changed, sharper, colder, the kind that made shadows stretch longer across the floor. I guided Matteo to the kitchen, where a kind-looking older woman named Rosa was preparing dinner. She smiled when she saw me, though the lines around her mouth deepened in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Moretti said you'd be staying for a few days," she said, her accent thick, her hands steady as she chopped herbs. "The boy eats better when you're around. That's good. He needs someone gentle." There was something about the way she said it, gentle, that made me glance up, as though she'd meant something more. "You've been here long?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Rosa hesitated, then nodded. Long enough to know the walls here have ears, she murmured, her voice low, eyes flicking toward the hallway. Be careful, ragazza. Some things are better left unheard. I didn't know what to say to that, so I busied myself helping her set the table, though my hands shook more than I'd like to admit. Matteo sat near the counter, humming softly to himself, tracing patterns with his fingers on the wood. When the meal was ready, Rosa disappeared down the hall, and for a while it was just us, the sound of clinking silverware and the faint hum of the refrigerator. But then, there it was again. A sound. Soft, distant, like footsteps above us. At first I thought it was nothing, just the creaks of an old house settling. But when I looked up, Matteo's fork froze midair, his head tilted slightly toward the ceiling. You hear it too? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He nodded, his eyes suddenly wide, uncertain. They walk at night, he said simply. Daddy says not to listen. A chill spread down my spine. I forced a smile for his sake, but every instinct screamed that something wasn't right. When I tucked him into bed later, I stayed longer than I needed to, brushing the hair from his forehead as he drifted to sleep. The room was soft and warm, filled with the faint scent of lavender from the linen. But even in sleep, his little brow furrowed, as if he dreamed of things he couldn't name. I turned off the light and stepped into the hallway. It was darker now, the kind of dark that felt alive, thick with breath and memory. I moved slowly, my hand brushing the wall for balance, and that's when I heard it again. Faint, deliberate footsteps echoing from somewhere above. I followed them. Each step felt heavier than the last as I climbed the staircase, the old wood creaking beneath my weight. The air grew colder the higher I went, the silence broken only by the rhythmic drip of water from a leaky pipe somewhere deep in the house. I reached the landing and saw a door slightly ajar at the end of the corridor, light spilling through the gap in a thin golden line. I don't know what made me walk toward it. Curiosity, fear, maybe something deeper. The pull of something forbidden. But when I pushed the door open, I stopped breathing. It wasn't a room, it was an office. Dark wood shelves lined the walls, filled with old books, ledgers, and framed photographs. Papers were scattered across the desk, and in the center of it all sat a small glass of whiskey. Half finished, the ice melted into stillness. And there, on the desk, was a gun. The metal caught the light, gleaming faintly beside a photograph of Adrian and Matteo. They were smiling, or at least trying to. The boy's grin was real, but Adrian's was tight, distant, like he didn't quite know how. I reached out, brushing my fingers along the frame, my stomach twisting at the sight. That's when I felt it, the unmistakable weight of someone watching me. I turned sharply, my breath catching, but the hallway behind me was empty. Still, I could feel it. That presence, invisible but near. The way the air thickened when you know someone's eyes are on you. My heart raced as I backed out of the room, closing the door quietly behind me. When I returned to my own room, the one Rosa had prepared for me on the lower floor, I locked the door and pressed my back against it, trying to steady my breathing. But the silence of the house didn't comfort me. It listened. Later that night, I woke to the sound of muffled voices outside my window. Male voices. Low, harsh, hurried. I crept closer, peeking through the sheer curtain, and my breath froze in my chest. 2 men stood near the gates, their silhouettes dark against the glow of the security lights. One of them was Adrian. The other, I didn't recognize, but I could hear fragments of their conversation, carried by the wind. She doesn't know yet, Adrian's voice murmured, rough and quiet, like gravel under velvet. She shouldn't be here, the other man hissed. It's not safe, not for her. You're making a mistake. Adrian turned, his profile sharp against the night. It's already done. There was a pause, heavy and final, before the other man spoke again. You think she can protect him? Adrian didn't answer. He just looked up, straight toward my window. I froze, stepping back, my heart hammering so hard it hurt. For a moment, I could swear our eyes met through the darkness, even though I knew it was impossible. Then he looked away, said something I couldn't hear, and the men disappeared into the night. I closed the curtain, but it was too late. Sleep wouldn't come again. Somewhere deep inside, I knew this wasn't kindness or coincidence anymore. I hadn't just stumbled into a man's home, I'd been pulled into his world. And whatever lived in the shadows of that house, it wasn't finished with me yet. Morning in the Moretti mansion didn't look like morning anywhere else. It wasn't sunlight pouring through the windows or the smell of coffee drifting through the air that woke you. It was silence, so thick and absolute that it pressed against your skin until you had no choice but to open your eyes and breathe it in. I woke before the house stirred, the memory of last night's voices still clawing at the edges of my dreams. I'd barely slept, every sound turning into something sinister, every shadow on the wall shifting when I looked away. When I stepped out of the guest room, the hallway stretched before me like a long, endless corridor of whispers and restraint. My reflection followed me in every polished surface. Mirrors, glass, even the lacquered floors seemed to carry my face back to me, reminding me I didn't belong here. I found Rosa already in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she prepared breakfast. She gave me a tired smile when I entered, her eyes flicking briefly toward the window before returning to the pan she stirred. You didn't sleep, she said, not as a question but a certainty. No, I admitted, sliding into one of the stools at the counter. Does anyone in this house ever sleep? Her mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Mr. Moretti? Never. Not since his wife. I looked up, surprised. He had a wife. Rosa's hand stilled for a moment. He has a past. She said carefully. Like everyone here, but some stories are too heavy to tell before breakfast. She turned away, her shoulders curving inward, and I didn't push. Still, the words stayed with me. The idea of a woman who had once lived here, perhaps in one of these dark hallways, perhaps smiling in those photographs lining the walls. What had happened to her? The air in this place was thick with absence. Maybe hers was what haunted it. When Matteo came bounding into the kitchen, barefoot and bright-eyed, the whole room softened. His joy had a way of breaking through everything. Walls, fear, silence. He ran straight into my arms, nearly knocking the cup of coffee from my hand. "Lena!" he squealed. "Daddy's home!" The words made my stomach tighten before I could stop it. I followed Matteo to the main hall, where Adrian stood by the door, shrugging off his coat. He looked exhausted. His tie loosened, his eyes shadowed, but still composed in that unnerving way of his. Even disheveled, he carried power like a second skin. When his gaze met mine, something flickered there. Something that wasn't quite warmth, but wasn't indifference either. "You're awake early," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "I don't sleep well in new places," I replied, though it wasn't the truth. It wasn't the house keeping me awake. It was him. He studied me for a long moment, his jaw tightening slightly. Then he crouched beside Matteo, brushing his son's hair back with a tenderness that felt foreign in a man like him. "You've been good?" he asked. Matteo nodded solemnly. "Lena stayed close, like you said." Adrian's eyes lifted back to me, lingering for a moment longer than they should have. Good. We had breakfast together, an odd, quiet kind of domesticity that felt borrowed, fragile, something that could crumble if either of us breathed too deeply. Matteo chattered about the garden, about a cat he claimed lived near the fountain, and for a moment, I almost forgot where I was. But then Adrian's phone buzzed, sharp and loud on the marble table, and the illusion shattered. He excused himself, stepping into the next room. I caught only fragments of his voice, low, tense, clipped, words like shipment and deal and debt. Then silence again. When he returned, his expression had changed. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by that cold composure I'd seen the night we met. "I have business to attend to," he said simply. "Rosa will stay close. And you?" He hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I'd like you to stay out of the West Wing." "The West Wing?" I asked, frowning. His gaze hardened. "It's under renovation," he said, too quickly, too easily. "It's not safe." But the way he said it, the way his voice dipped slightly, the faint tightening of his jaw, told me it wasn't about safety. It was about secrecy. When he left, the silence filled the house again. But my curiosity had already rooted itself deep, feeding on the unease that had been growing since the night I arrived. It wasn't long before I found myself wandering, my footsteps soft against the polished floors, my heart thudding like it knew I was trespassing, long before I reached the end of the West Hall. The door there was half open, the air behind it colder, the light dimmer. I stepped inside. The room was bare except for a single piano in the center, covered in a thin film of dust. A large portrait hung on the far wall, a woman, dark-haired and elegant, her eyes soft and distant. I recognized her immediately. It was the same woman from the photograph on Adrian's desk, his wife. She was beautiful in that timeless, tragic way, the kind of beauty that lingered like perfume long after the person was gone. I felt something ache in my chest as I stared at her, wondering what she'd been like, what she'd loved, what she'd feared. There was a shelf near the window, covered in books and small keepsakes. My hand trembled as I reached for one of them. A silver frame turned face down. When I flipped it over, I froze. It was a picture of her. Pregnant. The air seemed to vanish from the room. My throat closed, my stomach twisting as memories came flooding back. The sterile smell of the hospital, the flickering fluorescent lights, the sound of a heartbeat that should have kept going but didn't. For years I had buried it all, my own loss, my own silence, the tiny life that had once been mine, gone before it ever had a chance to cry. And now, standing there, holding this photograph of another woman who had carried her own heartbreak within these walls, I felt the edges of my past bleed into the present. I didn't hear the footsteps until they were too close to ignore. "Looking for something?" I turned sharply. Adrian stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, God, his eyes, were furious. I'm sorry," I stammered. "I didn't mean to—" He crossed the room in 3 slow, deliberate steps, his presence filling the space like smoke. "I told you not to come here." "I know, but you did anyway." His voice was quiet, dangerously quiet. "I saw the photo," I said softly, my throat tight. "Of her. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have—" Something in him broke then, just for a second. His hand clenched, his jaw worked, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was raw, stripped of the control he wore like armor. "She died 3 years ago," he said. "Car accident. Matteo was in the car. He lived. She didn't." The room tilted. He turned away, his shoulders rigid, his hand gripping the edge of the piano. "He doesn't remember much," he continued, his voice quieter now. "But sometimes he wakes up in the night screaming her name. You think I don't know what he needs? You think I don't know what it means to lose her?" His pain hit me like a punch, real and sharp and blinding. "I didn't mean to judge you," I whispered. "I just—" "Don't," he cut in, his tone final. "Don't try to fix what you can't understand." He left before I could speak again, the door closing behind him with a heavy, final sound that seemed to echo through my bones. I sank onto the edge of the piano bench, the silence pressing in. And as the light outside dimmed to gold, I looked back at the woman's portrait, at her soft eyes and painted smile, and whispered into the stillness, "Maybe neither of us can." But deep down, I knew something else. Something Rosa had hinted at. Something Matteo's words had brushed against. Adrian's grief wasn't just grief, it was guilt. And whatever had happened to his wife, it wasn't just an accident. The storm came the same night I decided to leave. It began with a whisper against the windows, a hesitant drizzle that grew into a furious rhythm, as if the sky itself had chosen to cry for everything I couldn't. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of rain and earth, and lightning stretched across the clouds like veins of white fire. I stood by the window in my small room, watching the world outside blur into motion, and I knew that if I didn't walk away tonight, I never would. After what I'd seen in the West Wing, after the raw ache in Adrian's voice, after the secrets I could feel breathing beneath the floorboards, I couldn't stay. Not for Matteo, not for my curiosity, not for the strange pull that kept drawing me back to the man whose pain was as magnetic as it was terrifying. I packed quietly, folding my uniform into my bag with trembling hands. The house creaked with the wind, and somewhere down the hall a clock ticked, slow, deliberate, echoing in time with my heartbeat. I wrote a note for Rosa, something simple. "Thank you for everything. Tell Matteo I'm sorry." I couldn't face him. Not the little boy with the wide blue eyes and the trust I didn't deserve. Not the man who looked at me like I was both salvation and temptation. I made it to the front hall without being seen. The storm outside raged against the glass doors, lightning illuminating the marble floors in flashes of silver and shadow. My reflection wavered in the glass, pale and fragile, like someone halfway between reality and a dream. And then I heard him, leaving without saying goodbye. His voice, low, calm, but threaded with something dangerous, came from behind me. I froze, my hand still gripping the handle of the door. Slowly I turned. Adrian stood at the base of the staircase, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, the top buttons undone, his hair damp as though he'd already been out in the storm. There was a glass of whiskey in one hand, the other shoved into his pocket. And even from across the room, I could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a flame. "I didn't think you'd notice," I said softly. He tilted his head slightly, that faint, humorless smile touching his lips. "In my house? I notice everything." "I can't stay here," I said. "This isn't my world. I don't belong in it." "Matteo needs you," he replied simply, taking a slow step forward. The sound of thunder rolled through the room, deep and distant. I shook my head. "He needs you. Not a stranger trying to fill a space that can't be filled." Adrian's eyes darkened. "You think that's what this is?" "What else could it be?" I whispered. "You brought me here because I said something stupid in a restaurant. Because I reminded you of her." His expression flickered, just enough to tell me I'd hit the truth. I stepped closer to the door, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. "Let me go, Adrian." He didn't move. He just stared at me for a long, unbearable moment. Then he said quietly, "You shouldn't have gone into that room." "I know," I said, "and I'm sorry. But what I saw, what I felt, it's not just grief, is it? You're hiding something." Lightning flashed again, bright enough to carve his face in light and shadow, revealing everything he didn't say. He looked like a man at war with himself, torn between confession and control. "Go if you want," he said finally, his voice low. "But the storm's bad. Wait until morning." I almost laughed, a soft, broken sound. I've survived worse weather. I pushed open the door, and the wind slammed against me like an invisible hand. The rain was cold, furious, drenching me instantly. I stepped out onto the stone steps, clutching my bag to my chest, but I hadn't made it 5 feet before I heard his voice behind me again, closer this time, raw. "Lena, stop!" I turned, rainwater dripping from my hair, my clothes clinging to my skin. "Why?" I shouted over the thunder. "So you can lock me up again in this mausoleum of yours and pretend it's protection?" He stepped out into the rain, the storm swallowing his figure in silver light. "You think I'd hurt you?" "I think you already are," I said, my voice trembling. "I think this place, this world, it's poison, and I can feel it getting inside me." He moved closer, slow but deliberate, every step sending a ripple through the puddles between us. "You don't understand what you've walked into," he said, his voice rough, the storm echoing behind every word. "There are people who would kill to see this house burn. You're here because Mateo needed you, but now that you're in it, you don't just get to walk away. You think I can protect you from out there?" "I don't want your protection," I whispered. "I want my life back." He stopped just in front of me. The rain poured down his face, darkening his shirt until it clung to the lines of his body. His hair slicked back from his forehead. His eyes, God, his eyes, burned with something I couldn't name. "You think you can just leave," he said softly, "but you can't, because I can't let you." The words hit me like thunder. "Why?" I asked. "Because I remind you of her?" He shook his head slowly, stepping closer until I could feel the heat of his breath through the rain. "No," he murmured, "because you make me forget her." I didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was him, maybe it was me, maybe it was the storm pulling us together like some cruel joke of fate. But suddenly his mouth was on mine, and everything else disappeared. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, aching. The kind of kiss that tasted like confession and punishment at once. His hands framed my face, his thumbs brushing my soaked cheeks. And for a moment I forgot the world. Forgot the fear. Forgot who he was. All I could feel was the heat of him. The pulse beneath his skin, the rain running down both our faces like tears we didn't have the strength to shed. When he pulled away, he rested his forehead against mine, his breath unsteady. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. "Then why won't you let me go?" I breathed. He didn't answer. His hands dropped from my face, curling into fists at his sides, and he stepped back, the storm swallowing him again. "Because I'm not strong enough to lose you too." Lightning split the sky, blinding for a heartbeat, and then he was gone, disappearing into the shadows of the house, leaving me standing there, drenched and shaking, with the taste of him still burning on my lips. I stayed there for a long time, the rain falling harder, the night growing colder. Somewhere behind me, I thought I heard Mateo's small voice calling my name from a window upstairs, but I couldn't tell if it was real or if the storm was just playing tricks. When I finally went back inside, the house felt different. Alive, awake, and somehow aware of what had just happened between its walls. The hallways seemed narrower, the air thicker, as though the house itself had been waiting for this moment. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, watching the rain blur the world outside, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, the way he'd looked at me like I was both the sin and the absolution he'd been running from. And for the first time since I met Adrian Moretti, I wasn't sure if I wanted to run from him or back to him. The morning after the storm, the world outside felt muted, washed clean, as if the sky had wept enough for all of us. But inside the Moretti mansion, the air was heavy. Too still, too fragile, like something sacred had been broken during the night. I didn't know if it was the storm, or the kiss, or the way his voice had trembled when he said he wasn't strong enough to lose me too. But something had shifted between us. Something irreversible. I barely slept. and when I did, my dreams were feverish. A blur of rain and hands and whispers that felt like both prayer and sin. When I finally stepped into the kitchen, the light was pale and uncertain, slipping weakly through the tall windows. Rosa was already there, her face drawn, her movements slower than usual. "You heard it?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Heard what?" I frowned. "The glass," she said, her hand stilling over the sink. "Someone broke one of the windows last night, in the east corridor." My stomach tightened. "An accident?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her apron and handed me something small and cold, something wrapped in a white napkin. "They found this under the window." When I unfolded the fabric, my breath caught. Inside was a single bullet casing, smeared with red. Not paint. Not rust. Blood. "Jesus," I whispered, staring at it. "Who would—" Rosa glanced toward the door before lowering her voice. "It's a message," she said. "They're warning him." I didn't need to ask who they were. In this house, you could feel it. The unspoken presence of men who lived by rules written in violence and silence, of debts that could only be paid in blood. "Does Matteo know?" I asked. She shook her head. "Mr. Moretti won't let him see. He says the boy should stay innocent." Innocent. The word felt like a prayer in a place that hadn't seen one in years. Before I could ask more, the door to the hall opened, and Adrian stepped inside. He looked like he hadn't slept either. His shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his tie hanging loose, the veins in his hands standing out like he'd been clenching them all night. When his eyes found mine, something raw flickered there. Something that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't tenderness either. "Rosa," he said softly, "give us a moment." She nodded and slipped out, her eyes lingering on me for a heartbeat longer than necessary, as if to say, "Be careful." When she was gone, the silence stretched thin. I set the bullet casing on the counter between us, my hands trembling slightly. "She told me," I said, "about the window." He stared at it for a long time, his jaw tightening, his thumb tracing the edge of the countertop. "You shouldn't have to see this." "Then stop letting it happen," I said, my voice shaking more than I wanted it to. He looked up sharply, his eyes darkening. "You think I can control everything?" "I think you try to," I whispered, "and I think that's why it's destroying you." His laugh was soft, bitter, empty. "You think you understand this world after what? A week here?" "I don't have to understand it to know it's killing you," I said. He stepped closer, the space between us collapsing like it always did, his voice low, dangerous, intimate. "You shouldn't be here, Lena. You shouldn't see any of this. But now that you have, you don't get to just walk away. They'll come for anyone connected to me, even you." "Then why bring me here at all?" I asked, the question bursting out before I could stop it. "Why drag me into this, into your house, your son's life, your mess? Why me?" He didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, looked through me, with those eyes that always seemed to see too much and not enough at the same time. Then softly he said, "Because you were the first person in years who looked at him and didn't see me." The air left my lungs. He took another step forward, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him even in the cold morning light. "And because when you looked at me," he continued, his voice almost breaking, "you didn't look away." I wanted to tell him that wasn't true, that I wanted to look away, that every time he was near I felt like standing at the edge of something beautiful and fatal. But my body betrayed me. My fingers trembled as they brushed against the counter, close to his, almost touching but not quite. "Adrian," I whispered, but before I could say anything more, the sound of glass shattering echoed through the hallway. He moved instantly, faster than I could even process, grabbing my wrist and pulling me behind him. The door burst open, one of his men stumbling in, blood running down his temple. "Boss!" the man gasped. "They hit the gate. 2 cars, black sedans, armed." Adrian's expression didn't change. If anything, it grew colder. "Get Mateo to the safe room," he ordered. "Now." The man nodded and disappeared down the hall. Adrian turned to me, his hand still gripping mine. "Stay here," he said. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I'm not hiding while—" "Lena," he snapped, his tone sharp enough to cut through the chaos outside. "You don't understand what's happening. If they get inside, they won't stop at me. They'll use you to get to him. I can help." His hand came up, cupping my cheek, his touch firm, desperate. "You don't know what help means in my world," he said softly. "It means blood." For a heartbeat, the noise outside faded, the shouting, the gunfire, the pounding of footsteps. There was only him, standing too close, his breath mingling with mine, his eyes filled with something that felt too much like goodbye. "Promise me you'll stay with Mateo," he whispered. I couldn't speak, so I nodded, my throat tight. He pressed his forehead against mine, just for a second. And then he was gone. Out the door, into the storm of noise and danger that waited beyond the walls. Rosa appeared moments later, her face pale, her voice urgent. "Come, quickly." We found Mateo in the library clutching a small stuffed bear, his eyes wide but dry. He didn't cry. He just looked at me. And in that look was something I didn't understand. Trust, maybe, or fear that trusted me to fix it. Rosa led us through a narrow passage behind one of the shelves, the walls cold and close. I could hear the sounds of chaos echoing above us, gunfire, shouting, the distant roar of engines. Mateo's small hand gripped mine so tightly that my fingers went numb. When we reached the end of the passage, Rosa pressed a hidden panel on the wall, revealing a steel door. Inside was a small room lined with shelves of supplies, a single monitor showing grainy black and white footage of the house. "Stay here," she said, her voice trembling. "Don't open the door for anyone but him." And then she was gone too. I sat on the cold floor, Mateo in my arms, the sounds of the world collapsing outside our metal cage. The monitor flickered, Adrian moving through the halls with that same unnerving calm, gun in hand, his movements sharp and deliberate. Every time a shadow passed near him, my heart stuttered. Then suddenly the screen went dark. Mateo buried his face in my shoulder, and I held him tighter, whispering words I didn't believe. "It's okay. He's coming back. He always comes back." But the truth was, I didn't know if that was hope or a lie. Hours later, minutes, maybe, I couldn't tell, the sounds stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the gunfire. When the steel door finally opened, Adrian stood there, covered in blood that wasn't all his eyes hollow and unrecognizable. He didn't speak. He just looked at me, then at Mateo, and something in him crumbled. He knelt, pulling his son into his arms, pressing his face into the boy's hair. Mateo whispered, "Daddy?" Adrian closed his eyes, his voice breaking. "It's over." But I saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. By morning, the blood had dried. Not just on the marble floors where the intruders had fallen, or on the white cuffs of Adrian's shirt, but in the air itself. The metallic scent of violence lingering in every hallway. A silent reminder that this house, for all its beauty, was built on bones. The staff moved like ghosts, cleaning, mending, pretending, but no one dared to look Adrian in the eye. Not even me. I found him in his study hours later, sitting in the half-light, his hands clasped together, his expression carved from stone. The room still smelled faintly of gunpowder. His jacket was gone, his sleeves rolled up, and his knuckles were raw, split open where he'd struck something or someone. He didn't look up when I stepped inside. "They're gone?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He nodded once, his eyes fixed on nothing. For now? For now? He finally looked at me then, and I almost wished he hadn't. There was something terrible in his gaze, something cold and burning at once, like grief wrapped in rage. "This doesn't end," he said quietly. "It never ends." I wanted to ask why, but I already knew. You didn't build empires like his without enemies. You just tried to outlive them. Still, there was something about this attack that didn't fit. It hadn't been random. The precision of it, the timing, it had been personal. And as I looked at him, at the exhaustion etched into every line of his face, something clicked into place that I hadn't wanted to see before. "This was a message," I said, "for you." His jaw tightened. "Everything's a message in this life." "But it wasn't about you, was it?" I pressed. "It was about Matteo." His eyes flashed then, sharp as broken glass. "Don't!" I stepped closer, heart pounding. "Don't what?" "Pretend I don't see what's happening? You think I don't notice the way you look over your shoulder every time he laughs, like you're waiting for someone to take that sound away from you?" He stood abruptly, the chair scraping across the floor. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Then tell me," I said, my voice trembling. "Tell me what I don't know." He stared at me for a long, heavy moment, and for the first time I saw something like fear in him. Not of me, but of the truth itself. "Please, Adrian," I whispered, "you owe me that much." His voice, when it came, was soft but sharp, each word measured. "There are things I've done you wouldn't understand. Deals I made before Matteo was born. I thought I could keep that world away from him, from her. But nothing in my life stays clean." "Her," I echoed. "You mean your wife?" His gaze flicked up, something dark crossing his expression. "She didn't die because of me," he said, too quickly, too defensive. "But you blame yourself," I said quietly. He looked away, and the silence that followed was an answer on its own. I turned to leave, needing air, needing distance, but as I reached the door, something caught my eye. A photograph, half hidden beneath a stack of papers on his desk. I hesitated, then picked it up. It was old, blurry around the edges. A picture of a car wreck. Metal twisted, glass shattered, lights flashing in the distance, and in the corner of the frame, barely visible, was a familiar figure. My chest went cold. "Where did you get this?" I asked, my voice suddenly tight. Adrian turned sharply. "Put that down." "Where did you get it?" I repeated, louder this time. He crossed the room in 2 strides, his hand closing around my wrist. "It's not what you think." The contact sent a jolt through me, not fear, not pain, but a desperate, trembling confusion. "What is it then?" I demanded. "Because that's my old neighborhood, Adrian. That's the intersection where—" My breath caught. "Where I lost my baby." He froze. The world tilted, my pulse roaring in my ears. "You were there," I whispered. "You were there." His grip loosened. His voice broke on the words. "I didn't know, Lena, I didn't— Don't lie to me," I shouted, the sound cracking like thunder in the still air. "You knew. You've known this whole time." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing, the mask finally slipping. "I wasn't the one driving, I swear to you," he said, his voice raw, desperate. "It was business. One of my men, a deal gone wrong. Your car wasn't supposed to be there. I didn't even know your name until that night in the restaurant, I swear I didn't. But when I saw you, when you said those words, 'He just needs a mom,' it was like every ghost I've ever buried came back to breathe down my neck." Tears stung my eyes, hot and relentless. "You destroyed my life." "I saved it," he said fiercely, stepping closer, his voice cracking under the weight of it. "That night could have killed you. You were supposed to die, Lena. They were supposed to kill me. The room spun. I stumbled back, shaking my head. You're telling me the man who took everything from me is the same man who's been pretending to save me? He flinched, the truth landing between us like a body. It wasn't pretending, he said softly. I didn't know who you were when I brought you here. But when I found out, when I saw what I'd done, how could I let you go? My breath came in shallow gasps. The edges of my vision blurred. You should have. He stepped closer, his hands trembling. You think I haven't tried? You think I don't wake up every night seeing that crash? You think I don't see her and you and everything I've destroyed every time I close my eyes? You can hate me, you should, but don't think I don't know what I've done. Then why keep me here? I whispered. Because I thought I could make it right, he said, his voice breaking. Because Matteo needed you and maybe I did too. I wanted to scream, to hit him, to cry until the walls cracked, but instead I stood there shaking, staring at the man I'd kissed in the rain, the man whose son had called me family, and realizing that every tender thing between us had been built on ruin. You should have told me, I said finally, my voice trembling. You had the chance every day since I walked in here, and you didn't. I was afraid, he said softly, of losing me. He met my eyes, of losing what little redemption I thought I had left. A sound broke the silence, the faint creak of the floor outside the door. Both our heads turned. Adrian moved first, crossing the room, throwing open the door. Nothing but an empty hallway. But I'd seen it. A shadow. Someone had been there, listening. Who else knows? I asked. He turned back to me, his expression grim. If it's who I think it is, everyone. What do you mean? He didn't answer. He just crossed the room, pulling a drawer from his desk, tossing a gun onto the table. Pack whatever you can carry, he said. We're leaving tonight. Leaving, I echoed. He looked up, and for the first time I saw fear. Not for himself, but for me. They're coming for you next, Lena. They know who you are now. It happened so fast that I still can't tell where the night ended and the nightmare began. Adrian had been right about one thing. Nothing in his life ever truly ended. It only came back wearing a new face, a darker intention, a sharper blade. After he told me the truth, after I saw the guilt burning behind his eyes like a fever, I'd packed what little I owned with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. He'd told me to take Matteo and wait by the car, that he'd be right behind us, that we were leaving before the city had a chance to breathe again. But the house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't come from peace. It comes from something holding its breath, waiting to strike. I remember crouching in Matteo's room, helping him into his coat, whispering to him that we were going on an adventure. He smiled sleepily, trusting, because children don't understand the weight of the word escape. I didn't have the heart to tell him it wasn't an adventure. It was running for our lives. Then just as I reached for his hand, the lights went out. The entire mansion plunged into darkness. Matteo gasped, clutching my leg. I tried to speak, to calm him, but my voice came out cracked, foreign. Somewhere downstairs, glass shattered, then a gunshot split the silence. I grabbed Matteo, pulling him toward the back stairwell. My heartbeat pounded so loud it drowned everything else out. We made it halfway down the steps before the front door exploded inward. The sound was deafening. Wood splintering. Boots slamming against marble. Voices shouting in Italian. They were inside. Lena! Adrian's voice roared from somewhere near the study. Get him out! Now! The last thing I saw before the smoke swallowed everything was him. Gun in hand, moving like something primal. A man built for violence, for survival. He turned toward the invaders, and for a moment, the shadows looked like they bowed to him. Then Matteo screamed. Strong arms yanked me back. Rough cloth pressed over my mouth, and the scent of chloroform filled my lungs before I could even struggle. The last thing I remember was Adrian's voice, distant, furious, helpless, echoing my name. And then, darkness. Yet when I woke, the world was made of concrete and cold air. My wrists burned where the rope had rubbed them raw, my head pounding. The air smelled like oil, metal, and rain. I was on the floor of what looked like an old warehouse. Rusted beams above, broken windows letting in slices of gray dawn. Matteo. I turned sharply, heart stopping until I saw him, curled up beside me, small, terrified but alive. His hands were tied too, but his eyes found mine instantly, wide and wet. "It's okay," I whispered, my throat dry. "We're okay. I've got you." He nodded, trying to be brave, though his lip trembled. There were 3 men in the room. I recognized none of them, but I knew who they belonged to. The same men Adrian had spent his life fighting, betraying, surviving. The kind of men who didn't believe in mercy, only leverage. One of them, a tall man with a scar down his cheek, noticed I was awake. He grinned, stepping closer. "Welcome back, Bella. The boss will be happy to see you." My voice shook, but I forced the words out. "You don't need me. Let the boy go. He's just a child." He crouched in front of me, his breath sour, his grin widening. "He's his child. That makes him worth more than gold. You, though." He tilted his head. "You're a surprise. The waitress who made the devil bleed." The others laughed softly. The sound was worse than the silence. I turned my face away, fighting tears. I couldn't break. Not in front of Matteo. The man with the scar stood cracking his knuckles. "He'll come for you," he said. "He always does. And when he does, we'll make him watch before we end him." Matteo whimpered. I pulled him closer, whispering his name until his shaking eased, though I could feel my own pulse thrumming wild beneath my skin. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Time didn't exist there, only fear and the sound of dripping water echoing off the walls. Then, somewhere in the distance, an engine roared. The men froze. One of them swore under his breath, grabbing a rifle. Another peered through the broken window, cursing. "He's here." The one with the scar smiled, pulling a knife from his belt. "Good, let him come." I didn't see the first shot, I only heard it. A sharp crack that split the air, followed by chaos. Bullets ripped through the metal walls, sparks flying. The men shouted, ducking for cover. I threw myself over Matteo, pressing him close as the world erupted around us. And then, silence. A door slammed open. Heavy footsteps. "Lena!" His voice. Adrian stepped into the dim light, gun raised, blood on his sleeve, his expression colder than death. For a moment, he didn't look human. He looked like something made from vengeance and grief, like the storm had followed him here and made its home in his chest. When his eyes found mine, something in him cracked. He crossed the space in seconds, cutting the ropes from my wrists, his hands shaking. "You're okay," he breathed, his voice rough, his forehead pressing to mine. "You're okay." Matteo clung to him instantly, crying into his father's shoulder. Adrian wrapped one arm around him, holding him close, his other hand still gripping the gun. The man with the scar groaned somewhere behind him, crawling across the floor, blood blooming beneath him. Adrian turned, his face hardening. "You should have stayed buried," he said. "Go to hell," the man hissed. Adrian's voice dropped, quiet and cold. "I already live there." The gun went off once, and then it was over. The echo lingered long after the smoke cleared. Adrian didn't look at me as he holstered the weapon. He didn't look at anyone. He just knelt there, his hand trembling as it brushed Matteo's hair. I watched him in silence, the weight of what he'd done, what he'd become, pressing down on both of us. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "You shouldn't have seen this." "But I did," I said softly. He turned to me, his eyes empty and infinite. Then you understand now. Understand what? That there's no leaving this, he said. Not for me, not for you, not anymore. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that we could still walk away, that love was enough to heal the monsters inside him. But then I saw Matteo looking at us, small and silent, his eyes too old for his years. And I realized Adrian was right. Love doesn't save men like him. It only burns slower. We left the warehouse before dawn, the city still asleep, the world pretending it didn't hear the ghosts we'd made. Adrian drove in silence, his hands gripping the wheel, his knuckles still stained with blood. Matteo fell asleep in my lap, his small breaths steady against me. I looked at Adrian, at the man who had ruined my past and rewritten my future, and I knew this wasn't over. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't peace. It was survival. And survival, in his world, was the closest thing to love there would ever be. The city never really slept after that night. But maybe that was because Adrian Moretti didn't either. In the days following the abduction, he changed. Or maybe he just stopped pretending to be anything else. The mask of civility slipped away, revealing the man beneath. The one people whispered about in back rooms, the one whose name was spoken with fear, not respect. The Mafia boss's son, raised in blood, trained in silence, now reborn in vengeance. The air around him seemed to vibrate with violence. Every night he disappeared. Every dawn he returned, blood on his cuffs, exhaustion in his eyes, a different kind of darkness trailing him like a shadow that refused to leave. He didn't speak of where he went or what he did, but I could tell by the tension in his body and the hollow quiet in his voice that he was unraveling. I tried to reach him, but he was no longer a man. He was an echo, a weapon moving through the city, cutting through the people who had dared touch what was his. And I hated myself for it, but I loved him more each day. There was something about watching a man lose everything that makes you forget where your own boundaries lie. Every time he came home, every time he stood in the doorway, the storm still clinging to his clothes, I found myself standing closer. He never said the words. He didn't have to. The way his gaze lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking said everything. The way his hand brushed against mine in passing, hesitant and almost human, told the rest. But something inside him was cracking, and I knew it would break soon. It started one night when I woke to the sound of shouting, muffled, distant, coming from the back of the mansion. I slipped out of bed and followed the voices through the dark halls, the floor cold beneath my bare feet. Adrian was in the basement, surrounded by two of his men. One of them had a bloody lip, the other held a phone. There was another man, too, bound to a chair, beaten so badly I barely recognized him as human. "Talk," Adrian said quietly. The man in the chair spat blood on the floor. "You think you can scare me, Moretti? You're just your father's son, still trying to clean the filth off your name." Adrian's voice didn't rise. "And yet here you are, in my house, begging for breath." The man laughed weakly. "You think she'll love you when she finds out who you really are?" Something shifted in Adrian's eyes then. A flicker of raw pain, quickly drowned by rage. He picked up the gun from the table, turning it over in his hand, slow and deliberate. "I don't need her to love me," he said softly. "I just need her safe." The shot was deafening. I flinched, my hand flying to my mouth. The man slumped forward, blood pooling at his feet. Adrian didn't look away. He just stood there, staring at the body as if it might somehow absolve him. One of his men whispered, "Boss, that was the last one." "No," Adrian said, his voice low. "There's always one more." That was when I realized it wasn't vengeance anymore. It was obsession. He wasn't trying to protect us. He was trying to erase every version of himself that had ever failed. I turned away, my stomach churning, and crept back up the stairs before he saw me. But even in my room, I couldn't stop shaking. This man had saved me. This man had destroyed me. And now I didn't know which version of him I was falling for. The broken one, or the one who was breaking everything else. The next morning, he found me in the kitchen. He looked empty, like something vital had burned out inside him. "We're leaving the city," he said flatly. "It's not safe anymore." "Adrian," I said carefully, "running won't fix what's happening to you." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You think I can be fixed?" "I think you're trying to make the world bleed for something that isn't its fault," I said softly. "You can't kill your guilt, Adrian." His jaw tightened. "No. But I can kill the men who made me carry it." I stepped closer, reaching for his hand, but he pulled away, pacing to the window. Rain streaked down the glass again, the city outside blurred and distant. "I've done things, Lena," he said quietly. "Things you wouldn't forgive." "Then let me decide that," I said. He turned, and for a moment his expression softened. "You don't understand. If I let you in any further, there's no coming back." "Maybe I don't want to come back," I whispered. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and whatever battle had been raging in him ended. His hand came up, fingers brushing my cheek, rough and trembling. "You should have run when you had the chance." "Maybe I still will," I said, though neither of us believed it. We stood there for what felt like forever, the air between us heavy with everything we couldn't say. Then Mateo's small voice broke through the silence. "Daddy?" We both turned. He was standing at the doorway, holding his stuffed bear, his blue eyes wide and uncertain. "You're leaving again?" he asked. Adrian knelt, pulling him close. "Not tonight, Piccolo," he murmured. "Not tonight." But I saw the lie in his eyes. That night I woke again to the sound of engines outside, the low growl of approaching cars. Headlights cut across the window. I ran to the hall just as Adrian burst through the door, his gun drawn. "They found us," he said. The next few minutes blurred into chaos. Gunfire erupted outside. The windows shattered. I grabbed Mateo, pulling him toward the back, but a sharp pain exploded in my shoulder. I fell, my body slamming against the floor. "Lena!" Adrian shouted, firing back through the doorway. He reached me, his hand gripping mine, dragging me toward the kitchen, where the back door hung open. "Keep moving," he said. But the blood was warm and slick between my fingers. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. He looked at me, panic flickering in his eyes, the first real fear I'd ever seen in him. "Stay with me," he said. "Do you hear me? Stay with me." We stumbled into the rain-soaked yard. One of the attackers lay sprawled in the mud, unmoving. Adrian turned, firing again, but the bullet caught him in the side, and he staggered, blood blooming through his shirt. "Adrian!" I screamed. He dropped to one knee, his breath ragged. "Go," he said. "Get him out." "I'm not leaving you." "Lena." He coughed, crimson staining his lips. "Please." Mateo clung to me, crying silently, his small fingers gripping my sleeve. The sound of sirens began to rise in the distance, distant but growing closer. Adrian smiled faintly, his hand reaching for mine. "Looks like your world finally caught up to mine." "Stop talking," I said through tears. "You'll be okay. You're going to be okay." He shook his head slowly, eyes half-lidded. "If I don't make it." "Don't you dare finish that sentence," I whispered, pressing my hand to his wound, desperate, useless. He looked at me one last time, and in that look was everything. The confession he never said, the apology he couldn't make, the love he didn't think he deserved. Then his body went limp. "Adrian!" The sirens grew louder. Matteo was crying now, shaking against me. I held them both, my blood and his mixing in the rain, and for the first time in my life I prayed. Not for salvation, not for justice, but for time. Just one more heartbeat. One more breath. One more chance to tell him I loved him. Rain and blood have the same taste when they reach your lips. You don't realize it until you're holding someone you love and can't tell which one is washing the other away. Adrian's head was heavy in my lap that night, his breath uneven, fading like the last ember of a dying fire. The sirens came and went, blue and red flashing across the wet ground, painting us both in color and sin. I don't remember the paramedics' faces, only the cold hands pulling me back. The way Matteo screamed his father's name until his voice broke. I remember how the world tilted as they loaded Adrian into the ambulance, his blood drying on my skin like a promise that would never be kept. The hospital lights were too bright. Everything after that blurred into white corridors and antiseptic air. The rhythm of machines keeping time with a heart that refused to stop even when it should have. They let me sit by him when the doctors were done, when they couldn't do anything more but wait for the body to decide whether it still wanted to live. He looked smaller then. Fragile. The man who had filled every corner of every room now lay beneath thin hospital sheets, pale and still, the bandages across his chest already darkening where the wound refused to close. His hand was cold in mine, but I held it anyway, because I didn't know how not to. Matteo slept in the chair beside me, curled into himself, clutching his little bear. Every so often he'd twitch in his sleep and whisper, "Daddy." And every time, my heart cracked a little more. I don't know how long I sat there. Hours, days maybe. Nurses came and went. Machines beeped, but time didn't move. Then sometime after dawn, his fingers twitched. "Adrian," I whispered, leaning forward. "It's me." His eyelids fluttered, heavy and slow like it took everything in him just to open them. When he finally did, his gaze found mine instantly, and for a moment, it was like the world started again. "You stayed," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "Of course I did." My throat tightened. "You didn't give me a choice." A faint smile ghosted across his lips. "I never gave you much of anything but pain." "That's not true." He looked at me for a long time, as if trying to memorize my face. "You could still leave," he said softly. "You could walk out of here, take Matteo, and build a life that doesn't have my blood on it." "I'm already covered in it," I said, tears burning down my cheeks. "And I'm still here." He exhaled shakily, his hand tightening weakly around mine. "You shouldn't love me." "Too late," I whispered. Silence fell between us, thick and gentle all at once. The kind of silence that comes when there are no more lies left to tell. "I wanted to save you," he said after a while, his voice hoarse, raw. "But I don't know how to save anything without breaking it first." "You saved me anyway," I said. "You just don't know it." He turned his head, his eyes dark and unguarded. "And if I don't make it?" I shook my head violently. "Don't say that." "Lena, no." I leaned closer, pressing my forehead to his. "You don't get to leave me too. Not after everything." His breath trembled against my skin. "Then promise me something," he whispered. "Anything. Promise me you'll take care of him." My heart cracked open. "Matteo?" He nodded weakly. "He needs you more than he ever needed me. You were right from the start. He just needed a mom." The words hit me like a prayer I didn't deserve to hear. I nodded through my tears. "I promise." He smiled faintly, his eyes slipping closed again. "Good. Then I can rest." The monitors beeped softly in rhythm with his breathing, steady but fragile. I sat there long after the nurses asked me to leave, long after the sky outside turned from gray to gold, long after I'd run out of tears. When he finally woke again, hours later, maybe days, something had changed. The darkness was still in his eyes, but it was quieter now, like he'd finally stopped running from it. The man who had lived by violence now spoke softly, each word careful, deliberate, like he was learning the language of gentleness for the first time. He stayed in the hospital for weeks. I stayed with him. Matteo brought him drawings every morning, little sketches of the three of us in stick figures, holding hands, standing under a sun that looked too bright to ever exist in our world. Adrian always smiled when he saw them, even when he was too tired to speak. Sometimes, I'd catch him looking at me with that same unreadable expression he wore the first night I met him, the night his son had cried in the restaurant, and I'd whispered words that had bound our lives together. Only now, there was something softer behind it, something human. When he was finally strong enough to leave, the doctors warned him to rest, but he never really knew how. He insisted on walking out himself, Matteo's hand in one of his and mine in the other. We didn't go back to the mansion. It had been sold, sealed off like a chapter in a book we couldn't bear to reread. Instead, we found a small house on the edge of the city, a place with creaky floors and sunlit windows, where the air didn't smell like ghosts. For the first time in my life, I cooked without rushing, laughed without guilt, breathed without fear. Matteo went to school. Adrian sat by the window most mornings, quiet, thoughtful, as if learning how to exist without war inside him. Sometimes he'd reach for my hand across the table, and even when he didn't say anything, I felt it. The apology that would never stop being spoken. The love that would never stop hurting. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air filled with the scent of rain, I found him sitting on the porch, staring out at the horizon. He looked at me and said, "Do you ever think we were meant to meet that night?" I sat beside him, resting my head on his shoulder. "No," I said softly. "I think we were meant to survive it." He smiled faintly, his arm wrapping around me, his thumb brushing the scar near my wrist where the rope had once burned my skin. "You still think I can be a good man?" "I think you already are," I said. "You just don't believe it yet." We sat there until the first drops of rain began to fall, soft and slow. Matteo's laughter floated through the open window, bright and unbroken. And for the first time, it didn't sound like a reminder of what was lost. It sounded like the beginning of something new. I looked at Adrian then, the man who had ruined me, remade me, and somehow taught me that love doesn't always save us, but it can still make the ruin beautiful. "I never thought I'd find peace in the same hands that brought me pain," I whispered. He kissed my temple, his voice low, steady. "That's the only kind of peace I've ever known." The rain kept falling, washing the world clean again, and in that quiet, I realized something I'd been afraid to admit from the start. Some stories don't end in forgiveness or redemption. They end in understanding. And maybe that's enough. Because even monsters once loved can learn how to be human again.